Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the La Crosse Public Library occupies the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, who've stewarded this land since time immemorial. The city of La Crosse occupies land that was once a prairie that was home to a band of Ho-Chunk. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in an attempt to forcibly and violently remove Indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands located east of the Mississippi River to occupied territory west of the river. Throughout the 1830s through the 1870s, the federal government conducted a series of 11 attempts to forcibly remove local Ho-Chunk by steamboat and railroad and by walking to reservations in Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, and then finally to Nebraska. The historic steamboat landing where the 1848 removal happened was right here in La Crosse, where Spence Park is downtown. However, many of La Crosse's Ho-Chunk found their way back to their homelands, and eventually the federal and local governments moved on to new strategies to eradicate Indigenous folks and culture from the newly established United States of America. As of 2016, Wisconsin was home to over 8,000 members of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and 230 of them lived in La Crosse County. To learn more about that history, you can visit the Archives and Local History Department upstairs. That's where I work. Otherwise, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Dr. Ariel Beaujot. She's Executive Director of the Here Here Project, which is downtown and also now on the north side. And she's also a professor of history at UWL. Her talk today will celebrate and educate on Indigenous history, specifically Ho-Chunk history here in La Crosse, while featuring the Here Here Project. I also want to do a little promo. There's Indigenous Peoples Day happening downtown. It's at the La Crosse Center and also in Riverside Park. So once you're done here today, you're welcome to go down to La Crosse Center. The mayor is going to do a proclamation at between 11:15 and 11:30. And then we have events happening all the way through 5 or 6 p.m. tonight. So hope to see you there.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to get right into it. La Crosse occupies the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk. I'm Ariel Beaujot. I'm white. I'm Canadian. I'm a professor at UW La Crosse. I'm the director of Here Here, and I own property in the city that was illegally ceded by the US government and platted by squatters in the 1840s. In this way, I build wealth for myself and for my descendants on land that was considered by those who originally lived here to be free for all. Okay, so I'm going to do this talk by employing the stories that are given to us by Ho-Chunk elders, and then also by people studying Ho-Chunks that are part of the Here Here project. Here Here is an audio documentary project that's in downtown La Crosse as well as the north side. We just launched on the north side a couple of weeks ago. What's the date today? Really, literally a couple of weeks ago. The way that it functions is there's signs, orange signs downtown and on the north side. When you call the phone number on the sign, you hear a story of the exact space in which you stand. So it's not an app, you don't have to download anything. You literally use your cell phones, even if you don't have data on them, in order to call the signs. Part of the reason for the project is for us all to listen to stories that aren't typically told to us white residents of La Crosse. So it allows us to hear stories that we wouldn't normally be able to hear. They're stories told within the communities, the Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, but they're not stories that are told directly to us. Not all of them. What we're going to learn through these narratives is how colonizers have attempted to erase Ho-Chunk culture and language with a variety of strategies. For example, in 1837, 20 Ho-Chunk leaders were forced to sign a treaty with the US federal government, ceding their lands east of the Mississippi River. This was Cessation 245. And it's called Treaty with the Ho-Chunk, and it was signed in 1837. However, those who signed the treaty were not authorized to do so on behalf of their leaders. Only the Bear Clan could do this. This was done purposely by the Ho-Chunk leaders as an act of resistance to the treaty meeting. In this way, the agreement held no legality for the Ho-Chunk people. Nonetheless, the US government forced violent removals. Because it was not legal to be removed, Ho-Chunks kept returning to their homelands over and over again. According to the US government, of course, it was legal. It was not until 1874 that the US government gave in to the non-treaty abiding Ho-Chunks' resistance, and they did this for this reason. It was just too expensive for the US to fund these removals over and over and over again. So the government shifted its focus to a new genocidal tactic, residential boarding schools. 14 known boarding schools were established in Wisconsin. Most locally connected were the federally run Tomah Indian Industrial School that ran from 1893 to 1941, and the privately run St. Mary's Indian School that ran from 1883 to 1969 in Odana, Wisconsin, that was run by the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, who live here in La Crosse. The purpose of these schools was to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children into white society. In these schools, children wore uniforms, were assigned anglicized names, their hair was cut, they were not allowed to use their language or have any contact with their family. They were taught basic education skills like math and English, but at least half of their days were spent learning labor skills. Girls were taught domestic servant skills, and boys were taught farming, construction, and machinery skills. These were gendered skills deemed important for Indigenous children if they were to join the working class of American capitalist culture. As a Canadian, I'm aware of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that ran in my country from 2008 until 2015. This is a $2 billion agreement that the Government of Canada made with Indigenous people in our land to investigate the full extent and harm caused by the residential boarding schools. They were also supposed to propose solutions and prevent future abuse of Indigenous communities. As part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Indigenous people told other Canadians about the violence they suffered at the hands of their keepers in the boarding schools. One school 45 minutes away from my hometown had teachers bet on physical fights that they set up between the boys. The boy who lost the fight was made to mop up their own blood. At another boarding school in Kamloops, British Columbia, where my uncle owned a home, 200 unmarked graves of Indigenous children were discovered by archaeologists, but known to Indigenous people outside the residential school there. It was discovered in the National Archives of Canada that nutrition research was being done on boarding school residents at 6 of our boarding schools under the auspices of the Department of Indian Affairs Canada, and that's a federal government office, between 1942 and 1952, where starving boarding school residents were tested upon to see the diseases that were caused by malnutrition. The commission resulted in 94 different calls for action that the government, museums, archives, the media, and citizens of our country must adhere to as a way of reconciling the wrongdoings of ourselves, our ancestors, and our nation. This work has not been done in the US as it was in Canada. The effects of these boarding schools for residents in Canada and in the US lingers today in the bodies and minds of Indigenous people who are descendants of the survivors. Another form of erasure seen in our community is a stereotyping and mascoting of Ho-Chunks in art and recreation. In this way, colonizers have sought to control the depiction of, the bodies of, and the meaning of Indigenous peoples as if they had become extinct. This is a popular belief from the 19th and early 20th centuries that in fact these cultures were dying off, these cultures and these people were dying off and becoming extinct. In La Crosse, we have seen stereotypical depictions of Indigenous peoples in Central High School's mascot, the Red Raiders, that lasted until 2020. UWL's school mascot, the Indians, that was their mascot until 1989. And the Hiawatha statue that stood in Riverside Park in La Crosse until 2020. Despite these efforts of the US government and colonizers, Ho-Chunks, their language, and their culture have persisted and are still a part of the community of La Crosse today. This is a story about how we, white settlers, have persecuted, erased, and erased the Indigenous peoples from the land on which we occupy, and still refuse to acknowledge our actions and complicity in this long history. Let's begin our tour of relevant Here stories by listening to a story showing that Ho-Chunks have been here since time immemorial.
We're going to start down by the Oktoberfest grounds in downtown La Crosse here. I'm going to talk about Native American cemeteries in La Crosse, and there were a lot of them that go back a long time before the city was developed. Many of them have been destroyed by the construction of the city. So the oldest known cemeteries that we have is down in the Oktoberfest grounds area, where back in the 1860s, when the city was just beginning to be developed, to some of the founding fathers who then turned those artifacts over to the State Historical Society. So some of those artifacts we now know are about 3,000 to 5,000 years old, and they include copper tools. So there's a copper axe, for example, that was recovered and probably came from a 3,000 to 5,000 year old burial, and then that copper axe was then turned over to the State Historical Society. There's no record of the burial. There was no archaeologist at that time. So that style of copper axe is typically found during that time period in burial. So there was a 3,000 to 5,000 year old cemetery down in the Oktoberfest at that time. The band that occupied La Crosse in the early 1800s was the Decorah Band. It was founded by Buzzard Decorah and then led by One-Eyed Decorah into the Black Hawk War in the 80s. But their village appears to have been down by downtown La Crosse. The main village was located down by the Oktoberfest grounds. I wish I was an archaeologist in La Crosse in 1860. And before it was all gone, there's so much that we missed. And fortunately, there's tidbits in the newspapers, going way back. And now with the internet, you can access the old newspapers. Most do research so much more easily than when I started in La Crosse in 1982, where you literally had to dig through and read the old accounts and such, or use microfilm. So what we know is the tip of the iceberg of what was here. My name is Robert Ernie Bozard, and I'm an archaeologist, and I worked at the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center at UW La Crosse from 1982 until about 2010. My focus is the Driftless area. I still work in the Driftless area. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Crosse and downtown La Crosse.
From the settler colonialist point of view, we should notice that we placed the La Crosse Oktoberfest grounds, a place where we celebrate, on top of grave sites. It is a form of erasure, obviously, to do this. Another example is that in 1893, Harvard archaeologists came to La Crosse to excavate and therefore destroyed the sacred effigy mounds that were located in what is now Myrick Park. There are still 2 of these mounds in the park, but at least 2 to 3 others were all destroyed. These archaeologists credited the effigy mounds around Wisconsin with an ancient culture that they called the mound builders. They refused to believe that the Ho-Chunks were sophisticated enough to be the descendants of such a culture. Even today, archaeologists and historians like myself refer to the grounds living in this, to the people living in this area as the Sorry, I've just only learned how to say this word properly. It's spelled O-N-E-O-T-A. Oneota. Thank you. Yeah, it's just this morning that I learned how to say the word that isn't spelled quite that way. Instead of the name that the Ho-Chunk give it give themselves, which is the Ho-Chunk. In this way, archaeologists and historians in our state erase the Ho-Chunk from their own history and their own land. During this time, in the late 1800s, as the mound builder theory gained popularity, the non-treaty abiding Ho-Chunks who were living here came back as a form of resistance from the 1830s to the 1870s. So this is going to lead us to our next story, which is about some of those non-treaty abiding Ho-Chunks that were here. And this is told by Tom Jones, who is a professor at UW-Madison.
I'm standing outside of Duluth Trading Company, the original building where Dorflinger's was located. Oftentimes, Ho-Chunk women would sit in front of stores like Dorflinger's. During that time, they were able to spend their time making these baskets to help support the family. So they would make these baskets purely to sell to the tourists. And that's how a lot of families actually survived. So I started a book, The People of the Big Voice, Photographs of Charles Van Scoik. And after I completed that book, I then decided that I wanted to do another book, and I was interested in the fact that Ho-Chunk baskets weren't being made that much anymore. We have about 14 basket makers currently. So I'm hoping that it will revive that tradition and also kind of have an encyclopedia of different styles of baskets. Basket makers would use their imagination and make all kinds of different shapes. There's so many different kind of styles, and I've gotten to the point now when I'm purchasing baskets is I'm only looking for those unusual ones. My favorite basket is one that my mother has, and what it was two-tiered and on a stand, and I didn't know what it was for. It kind of looked like a sewing type basket. It's about maybe 3 feet wide and a foot deep. And I showed it to an elder, and she said that was actually a baby's bassinet. My name is Tom Jones. I am a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation.
Women were selling baskets on the street because they needed to function within Western culture and earn money to pay for goods. So they chose this work in order to preserve a cultural art form. Note that this is a form of resistance to assimilation. It's important to understand the context of the times in which this was happening. We believe from archival sources and also stories that we've heard that women were selling these baskets from the 1890s until the 1950s in La Crosse. This is the same period when the US government began to heavily fund residential boarding schools for assimilation, and Indigenous knowledge was threatened in unprecedented ways. By taking away their children, the knowledge of basket weaving and other Indigenous arts would be lost. This is why Tom Jones made a point to say that there are only 14 basket weavers left in Wisconsin. There are other examples of Indigenous people resisting assimilation in this period. One example is that the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration's boarding school used to hold pageants. At this school, they assimilated Ojibwe children and did not allow them to speak Ojibwe, dress in traditional clothing, or observe their spirituality. However, once a year, elders were allowed to come into the school and hold what the sisters called pageants, where they would sing, dance, and dress in traditional clothing and perform ceremonies. While white visiting audience members did not thought that they were observing a dying cultural practice, the Ojibwe elders were sure to inform the children that they were teaching their cultural ways. They were purposely preserving their culture as an act of resistance. Boarding schools were so effective at stripping Indigenous culture from the people who practiced it thereby making Indigenous life and culture no longer a threat to the American state, that by the 1950s, we see a large increase in imagery of Indigenous people being used for tourism. Now it's time to talk about Dan Green, a professor emeritus at UWL who studied stereotypical Native American imagery designed by white people to erase the true history of Indigenous people and their modern livelihoods. Dan Green specifically talks about the Big Indian statue that was built by the Chamber of Commerce in 1961 in Riverside Park. During the height of this phenomena of Native imagery to attract tourism. Let's listen to this story about the Big Indian, which is told in 2015 before the statue was taken down.
We're in the north end of Riverside Park. I just turned my back symbolically on what the UWL Native American students used to refer to as the Colossus of Kitsch, or as Riverside Park calls the Big Indian. First, my name is Keracho Maniga. That means the person who paints the sky blue. You know me as Dan Green, what Malcolm X might have called my slave name. At the time, the late 90s, the Chamber of Commerce in La Crosse proposed $50,000 into a paint job on the Colossus, something that reinforces stereotypes about Native Americans. As a sociology student, I had for years looked into the influence of imagery, statuaries, and I was a part of the National Anti-Native American Sport Mascot Movement. I traveled to University of Illinois, University of North Dakota, and Cleveland, Ohio on a regular basis to demonstrate and to teach about the harms, the largely psychological harms of this kind of imagery of the Big Indian standing behind me. So that was my interest, that here it is in my hometown where I'm raising children that look like me. They're brown-skinned, they're dark-haired. We don't get mistaken for anything but Native American. And here's something in our hometown reinforcing harmful thinking about us. So I was compelled to do something. By fortune, in the late 80s, I had a friend who was the editor of the editorial page for the local paper, and he had a new idea where he would have guest editorialists every Sunday. And he called me up saying that there were no people of color on his list. Would I volunteer to do 4 editorials over the course of the next year? I said, wonderful. So I chose the opportunity, taking a look around me, not just the Colossus of Kitsch, but the Freight House restaurant right there, and there's a number of stores just a few blocks away, all with the same archaic imagery, out-of-date, primitive, savage, Native American imagery out there. So I took that opportunity to write these editorials using scientific principles and concepts as to how we're influenced by this imagery, and I got hate mail. People actually called. That was very violating in my own home to have somebody calling me names and never attacking my principles, never even addressing the science of it. It was very demagogic. It was all emotion-laden, never an appeal to reason. And that's exactly what I was trying to do. I was trying to get people to use their head, to make them think, and not just react on an emotional level. But it went by a whole lot of people. Over the years, the Big Indian has become a symbol with what is wrong with our perception of Native America. Columbus Day, how we teach about Columbus, we make a hero of this mass murderer, this initiator of the transatlantic slave trade, did so many things that were just against humanity, and yet we hold him up as a hero. Well, here is this maybe well-intended statue, but what we have to remember is that intentions do not determine consequences. Maybe these things were supposed to be honoring of Native Americans, and we appreciate the intention, but do we appreciate that maybe that's not what they resulted in? Maybe a mistake was made. Well-intentioned, but a mistake was made. So the Big Indian became this symbol for not only what was wrong, but what to do about it. And so the Native American Student Association began using it as a gathering point. And they would march down here from the university, and we would have invited speakers and others who had an interest in changing how we perceive Native Americans and others, for that matter. 1 block away, there is the freight house. And if you look in front at the main entrance, you'll walk by a fiberglass statue of a Pullman porter. And if you look at it, that person's skin is colored to resemble a Caucasian. But if you take a look, I found original photographs of that, and it was a black man. So at some point they repainted it, I'm assuming not to offend African Americans. So that was well intended. Well, why don't they do the same thing to the Colossus of Kitsch? Bring him into the modern era. If you take a look at all, with incredible exception, all of Native American imagery from Leinenkugel's beer to Land O'Lakes butter, etc., is always Native Americans in the past, dressed in buckskins, if dressed at all, with feathers, drums, horses, primitive weapons. Never are they shown as rock and roll artists or using a laser printer or anything like that. And that's what's wrong. So if it's got to stay, let's at least make a statement. Let's bring them into the present.
What Dan is doing is talking about the different imagery that coalesced in the 1950s and 1960s to represent Native Americans when all it was a series of stereotypes. When I researched the Hiawatha statue in 2018, one of the major discussion points from the 1990s debate was whether or not the paint colors on the Hiawatha statue were correct according to Ho-Chunk tradition. It took me a long time to realize that this was just a red herring. It was in fact, the Hiawatha statue has nothing to do with any Native American traditions. And the placement of Hiawatha at the convergence of three rivers represents a meaning that's even more sinister. This was a place from which Ho-Chunk people were removed in 1848. That's the place where Ho-Chunk families drowned and died, jumping off of steamboats that were taking them away from their home. And here we placed a tourist draw. Art continues to be placed in our city for tourism, and a more recent example is the Confluence mural on the side of the pump house. As you listen to this story, notice Tracy's concept of home. Remember that white settlement began here only in 1841. However, Tracy's concept of home incorporates those who were buried beneath the Oktoberfest grounds, those who created the effigy mounds, and those who died in and survived the boarding schools. Tracy is here in La Crosse today because she is a descendant of non-treaty abiding Ho-Chunks who refused to leave their home.
We're looking at the west wall of the pump house where a mural was unveiled in June of 2014. It's a mural that was done by John Pugh in the trompe-l'oeil style of artwork. It was a pretty big event. I first got involved with it because I had seen that they had gotten a grant to get this mural done, and I knew it was going to be in the trompe-l'oeil style. And then the artist was in town last fall, 2013, and he stopped in at the Hmong Cultural and Community Agency to talk with some of the elders and let them know what he was doing, because he actually has quite an interest in the diverse populations. And it was at that point that I realized I was actually an admirer of his work. And that same night they were holding like an open meeting for people to come in and see what the art mural was going to be about. So I attended that. It was really an interesting night. At one point they had asked what La Crosse meant to people in the audience, and I actually wanted to say it felt like home to me because I'm Ho-Chunk and my family has been here for a very long time, of course, but I didn't feel like everyone would understand it to the same extent that I do. And then after that got done, I actually just went up to say hello to John Pugh, and he invited me and one of my coworkers to go have dinner, and we ended up talking for a couple hours. I was really impressed with how he wanted to go about doing this because he really wanted to get a picture of the diverse populations of La Crosse actually in the artwork. And at one point while he was working on it, he was asking for pictures of Ho-Chunks. And I came over because he had been here for about a month working on it, and it was all covered with tarp so nobody could really see it. And he invited me to come up and take a look. And I got up there, and one of the primary persons or portraits that's on there right in the center, I almost cried because that's actually in Ho-Chunk tradition, one of my grandsons, Levi Blackdeer. Kinship structure is very different, but my great-grandmother and his great-great-grandmother were sisters. And I was just awestruck that he had taken that particular image, because the image he was using was from when my grandfather was granted the Medal of Honor for being a code talker during World War II. So I remembered that exact moment in time when that picture was taken that he based the portrait off of. And then I looked and I saw other individuals that I actually knew or I knew about, like Merlin Red Cloud. And then there's even a picture of 3 Hmong elders who are actually elders that I recognize. So I was just really deeply impacted by the photographs he used to base some of these portraits off of on this mural. The mural it represents basically the people of La Crosse. You can see someone rowing in the water, you can see images from Oktoberfest, a medical doctor, and the back set is the bluffs, and you see the water and the steamboat, and I just think he did a really great job of portraying La Crosse as a community. I love it, and I know part of the reason that they chose to put it on the wall of the pump house was because this is kind of more of an art district. It is a good way to get people to come down here and get to know the arts area of La Crosse. And I think it's important for people to come here and remember some of the history of La Crosse, because some of these are more historical portraits, some of them are more contemporary. There's someone on there that's still a young person, there's people that have passed on, and I think it's just a great thing to see and remind people of everyone that's been here, not just in the last 100 years, but everyone who's been here. I just really appreciated that they wanted to go with the trompe l'oeil, because a lot of artwork around La Crosse is statue, or it's very traditional two-dimensional, and with the trompe l'oeil you get the three-dimensional, and I think it's a really great way to show more contemporary types of artwork. My name is Tracy Littlejohn. I'm a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and I was born and raised here in La Crosse. I think it's important to hear stories from all kinds of people. We're used to hearing a lot of stories from the mainstream community, and I'm not quite there, part of the mainstream community, and I appreciate that people seek out our thoughts about things.
Tracy mentioned her grandfather was a code talker during World War II. This is yet another form of resistance, a way in which Ho-Chunk people could practice their language hidden in plain sight, not unlike the pageants or the basket weaving. Even when they are fighting on behalf of the United States, being a soldier and a veteran is highly prized because it ties back to cultural traditions. The Ho-Chunk Nation is considered a warrior society, and they have fought in every US war except the War of 1812, which, by the way, was with Canada. This is common in Indigenous cultures. In fact, 1 in 4 Indigenous people are veterans, which is far higher than any other racial group, including white people. 3 tribes from Wisconsin supplied the code talkers to the US military, and because of these 3 tribes, Wisconsin contributed the most code talkers of any state. Let's listen again to Tracy one more time in this story that takes place just across the street, and it's the newest Here Here sign that we've put downtown, where the Ho-Chunk Nation Three Rivers House is located in the old Masonic temple building. Listen to how she talks about home this time. In this case, home is food and making and eating traditional food made from the same ingredients as her ancestors used.
The address of the Three Rivers House is 724 Main Street in La Crosse. And when you're looking at it from Main Street, it's a huge, wonderful brick building. The Three Rivers House has created a home for a lot of Native people and Ho-Chunk families in this area, someplace where they know that they're going to feel safe and comfortable. The On Thanksgiving, Rethinking Thanksgiving, that was run by the Native American students from UW La Crosse. They would always come with recipes from home, and it was all Indigenous-based foods. And it was just a way to still participate in a community gathering and meal, but to let people have a chance to think about, these are the foods that have always been here, from the people that have always been here, and we need to think about what our roles are now. To me, a lot of it was just that feeling of a family working together in the kitchen. I always loved those. I was always amazed at how many people would show up for that. I thought it was amazing that so many people would be interested. My Ho-Chunk name is Choni Najiwi. My English name is Tracy Littlejohn, and I am a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and I am also a community member in the La Crosse area.
Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. Dan Green talked about Columbus as a mass murderer. On Main Street, between Cass Street and State Street, 8 blocks away at the intersection of State Street and Front Street, ho-chunks were forcibly removed in 1848, the same year that, that Wisconsin became a state. Governor Lewis Cass, whom Cass Street is named after, lobbied for President Jackson's 1832 Indian Removal Act and paved the way for the forcible removal of Indigenous people west of the Mississippi River. Despite these efforts by the US government to exterminate ho-chunks, they resisted. They are still here. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, there's 2 effigy mounds still in Myrick Park, and yes, they're marked. So they're not far from the nature center. Yeah, there's signage. There's signage, but they're not roped off. Yeah, they're like if you go to the nature center and you're facing the Mason Center, and then you go to the right, there's one right there, like maybe 50 paces away. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the Winnebago is the white person's name. Oh, sorry, yes. So the question was, years ago they were called the Winnebago, but you didn't say anything about that, to say the exact sentence. And I started to say that the Winnebago is the white name that we gave to the Ho-Chunk people. Ho-Chunk is Ho-Chunks are the name that they've given to themselves. That's what they call themselves. Yeah, that's right. They're always been Ho-Chunk. Yeah, so they've been Ho-Chunk. We gave them the name Winnebago, and then we've changed it. We, white people, now call them Ho-Chunk to respect the fact that that's their name. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could mention the effect of this papal bull back in 1493, doctrine of discovery.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so, so now, oh my gosh. So now I'll talk about this papal bull. Do you know the date of it? 14. Okay, in 1493, the Pope, and his name was?
Alexander?
Okay, Pope Alexander. Yeah, I'm not sure either. So Pope Alexander said that it is legal for us, white folk, us Europeans at the time, we wouldn't have been considered white back then, but us now, white folk, to take any lands that are non-Christian lands. And this is the basis. And so we took North America, we took South America, we took all of the lands of Africa as our own. And this is the basis, the legal basis for all laws. That's where we start in North America, right? So we start with the basis that we own this land, and then from there, all other laws are on top of that. So all white laws are piled on top of this one papal bull from the date again? 1493, right? The year after Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Yeah, there's a very, very good documentary that's free to watch on this called The Doctrine of Discovery. It is it's the Anglican folks in Canada that are trying to, because of the Peace and Reconciliation, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they're trying to come to terms with their church's history of forced removal and genocide, as we call it in Canada, of Indigenous people. Thank you for that question. Does that answer it well enough, or would you like to? I think you might be a lawyer and maybe you want to. Other questions? How about the Ojibwe? Oh. No, the Ojibwe are a different group of people, a different tribe. Yeah, yeah. So also it's the Ojibwe that are the ones that were in northern Wisconsin that the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration were teaching. Yeah, it's an Ojibwe school. Other questions? Yes. Yep, yep. That is definitely happening. So the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration are working with Ho-Chunk people from this area and Ojibwe people from this area, trying to go through a truth and reconciliation process with them. It's an ongoing process. It's work that is, as a Canadian, I will tell you, that is very, very difficult, speaks to the cores of who we are and what we believe, laws that were created hundreds of years ago. And it takes us taking ourselves apart, really understanding who we are and what was built up for us, and coming to terms with that. It's a very, very difficult and upsetting process that is a very important process for us all to go through, including the sisters. Well, in America, it's done kind of piecemeal. It's piecemeal. It's like, okay, the sisters are figuring out how to apologize for their running of their boarding school, for example. In Canada, it's more holistic. It's because it's a national effort. So for instance, I'll just give you an example of archives. So there's a lot of archives that are held privately by private churches, for example, or entire institutions like the Anglican Church, for example, or the Catholic Church that hold these records. Because they have records about Indigenous people in them, they have to make them public so that scholars can study them. And this is how we find out things like Indigenous people in 6 boarding schools in Canada were studied after the Nuremberg trials for malnutrition, illegally, according to all Western law, illegally studied, right? Starved and studied. So that's what, and there's 94 different things that in Canada that all different institutions need to do in order to do the reconciliation part. So you can look up those 94. You can look up the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission is very clear what the 94 are. In La Crosse, it would be lovely if we took on those 94 reconciliations and enacted them in our own institutions, because that work has been done, right? That work is done in Canada. It would be very unusual for nationally America to be able to do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission with the various folks that we have wronged in our history. But other countries are doing that. So in a small way, we could bring that information from other countries and take a look at those and enact them here in our city. Yeah, do you want me to put them on the, do you want me to pull them out? Yeah, 94 specific, they're very specific. I just gave you one example, the archive example. For instance, with the media, if there's any story that relates to Indigenous people, the media have to put that in, the Indigenous angle. Oh, are you gonna do it for me? Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you so much. Other questions? Yes. So yeah, there's other countries that have done Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa is another one, right? With Black and colored people, they've done Truth and Reconciliation. Of course, that's another group of people that we've enslaved in this country, and so that would be another place that we could look. We could look for more reconciliation tactics. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so okay, so this is a question about, yeah, so you would like to know more about Vikings. Okay. Yeah, so you're thinking about when Vikings came, so pre-1492? Right. I mean, this commission is about boarding schools. Yeah. So this commission is Canadians coming to terms with the issues that came. One more. No? Sorry. Yes, it's dealing with that issue in particular. What comes off of this is also, there's another commission that happens about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so there's a second commission that comes out of this commission about missing and murdered Indigenous women, because they're murdered and disappeared at a very high rate in Canada, more than any other women. Yeah. And to do with women also, the Canadian government has recognized that a lot of the mass murders that happen in our country start with domestic violence. And so we're starting to think about how women's bodies are used before these major atrocities happen, right? And there's a link here to the Truth and Reconciliation over missing and murdered Indigenous women. Yeah, she was in Montreal. Okay, so so Canada is founded by French and English people. um, oh God. This is a very complicated history. Okay, so the French in Canada, notice my last name is Beaujot. Ariel, Françoise, Francine Beaujot, that's what my name is, okay? Just to kind of give you a sense of who you're talking to. So I grew up in Ontario, and there's a French population in Ontario. There's French all across Canada, including in Quebec. If you go to school in Quebec, and if you are French, then your education is free the entire way along, right? Right into university, your education is free. So if you go to school in Quebec, if you are Kamala Harris, and she's come, and her parents, they've come, they're gonna get an education in French. Everywhere else in Canada, there's a certain amount of French that you need to get before you graduate, right? The idea is that the whole country should be bilingual, French and English. But notice, the whole country is not supposed to be bilingual, French, English, in Ojibwe or Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, nope. French and English. So the story in Canada is that the French and the English, even though the French feel that they have been colonized themselves by the country, have colonized the Indigenous people of Canada. Yeah, that gets really very, very interesting, because the census changes every time it comes out. And census takers, and I can only actually speak to the Canadian case here, but we have census takers in both countries. So the census changes, and then census takers change the way that they're recording people. So this is super interesting. So sometimes they would record according to a certain band or tribe, and then sometimes they would just record red, in Canada anyway. And then sometimes they wouldn't record at all. Sometimes they'd record half-blood. I'm just using the names on the census, right? But it depended year by year. And Indigenous people in Canada, as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, artists and so on, have access to a lot of funds. And they have to prove that they're Indian, right? And there's a series of things going on there. And sometimes they can't prove it because their ancestors or their relatives wanted to be seen as white, because they would be oppressed differently, less. and they wanted to get certain things, right? So they would sometimes lie to the census taker, or the census taker would look at them and say, no, this is somebody that's more white than red, and record them differently, right? And so it's very difficult for Indigenous people to follow through the census their history. Now, Indigenous knowledge is passed down from generation to generation until the boarding schools cut that off. And so they have this long knowledge that isn't just like their blood ancestors, but also their, you know, yeah, their larger community, right? And that's like the way that Indigenous people believe this, or my understanding of the way that Indigenous people understand this, is that it's kind of part of their DNA, right? There's the stories, the history is part of, it's part of who they are spiritually. And so they have access to that information in a different way than we do as Western genealogists, searchers, right? Because because genealogy and census taking and all that stuff, that's a white culture's way of trying to count people and trying to place people in certain categories. This all comes from the Enlightenment, so the 1780s, 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Where we white folk, as we're colonizing, tried to also make hierarchies and understand people in different ways. This is where museum catalogs come out, library catalogs come out of this, right? It's all about kind of systematizing and understanding and placing people and things and objects into a certain genealogy. And so it's a very white way of thinking about genealogy that we have, which is natural, right? This is the sea in which we whatever, do our breaststroke. But yeah, Indigenous people, I would say, likely have a very different understanding of how they consider their history and their yes, and that is actually very important too. So that's a process. God. Oh, I hope I'm doing justice here. I mean, this is part of the problem. I hope I'm doing justice. But okay, yes. So yes, and that the reason why that exists is because of the Indian. I named it in the Board of Indian Affairs, something like that. So according to the Board of Indian Affairs, and I could have the wording wrong, there had to be a list of those who were Ojibwe, those who are Chocunk, in order for them to give what they said that they would give when they ceded the land, right? So yes, those exist. Now, if you are Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk, you are entirely Indigenous, but you have to choose one of those tribes to be part of. And so if your children then marry somebody else who is part of another Indigenous tribe, let's say, then they'd become 1/4 Ojibwe, and they would eventually fall off the list of Ojibwe people and no longer be able to get the money that the US government, the money, the land, all the things that they're not getting really, but some of that stuff that they're getting that the US government had promised them when these treaties were signed. So there's all these ways, the census is one, these lists that are forced to be kept are another, of slowly reducing the amount of Indigenous people from our lands officially, right? They're still here, but officially, according to the US government, according to the Canadian government, they'll become less and less, and then eventually will disappear, which is part of the point, which has been part of the point since 1493. Yeah. Thanks for your questions. Whew, you guys are really testing me. Whoa. Okay, do you have other questions? Yeah. Yeah, well, no, justice will never be done. But has justice been done with, in the legal system with certain tribes? Yes. In British Columbia, for example, they're giving back land. So there are examples. But I'm not saying the Canadian government's perfect. In fact, I would like to say it's very imperfect. They have, this has been a very, very painful process for Indigenous people in particular. Yeah, and of course we don't want to give back our gains. The country doesn't want to give back their gains, their lands, they don't actually want to do this. Just like, like it would be very hard for me, and it will be very hard for the sisters to think about, well, what sort of white wealth am I accumulating because I've bought my house? How could I, or where could I eventually give back to, or now give back to the people whose land that I am literally sitting on, accumulating wealth with? What would that look like? It's a project that I've kind of had in the back of my head, wondering if I could figure something out about that, right? Like figure out how much wealth has accumulated over time through the house that I've had, how much of that is white wealth, likely it's most of it is white wealth, and then how would you give back that white wealth? Could I give 90% of my salary back to the Ho-Chunk? Like what would that look like? Yeah, that would be awesome. But of course, but don't forget the knowledge that's being taught in those universities. So another thing that, yeah, right, it is so complicated, but another thing that's happening in Canada is there's a lot of Indigenous positions, so positions for Indigenous people at the universities and in powerful positions, archives, museums, universities, so that Indigenous people will be able to take classes on Indigenous knowledge in those spaces, in those white spaces, universities. There's 94. There's 94. Yeah. So we read them. We think about them. We think about our point of contact there, what we can do if we're holding an archive. This is something that a friend of mine is going through. She knows that the hospital archives in London, Ontario have records for Indigenous people. Legally, according to the 94 reconciliations, they have to give those back. But it's this fight, right? Because they don't want to. Just like there's all kinds of things in our museums. There's all kinds of objects in our museums that are sacred Indigenous objects that we are just not saying are there. And so aren't repatriating. And in some cases, they don't know where to repatriate them because they're labeled wrong. Right? So it's complicated, but it's important work. Thank you very, very much.